Hi, and welcome to this short history on the chakras. My name is Siam Pascal. I'm the founder of the Light Collective, and if you're interested in content around classical tantra, yoga, as well as yoga practices, pranayama, mantras, then feel free to subscribe below. The work that I spread is often coming from our yoga teacher trainings, which are very in-depth and often draw upon the classical tantric tradition. And this series of teachings is really coming from two places: our 200-hour yoga teacher training and our advanced Light Collective method, which we run annually. So if you're interested in going into more depth, make sure that you take a look at our website. So let's get stuck into it. First of all, I want to preface all of the work that I'm talking about on the chakras with a sense that what is commonly taught around the chakras isn't necessarily accurate. I am not here to judge anyone because I myself had been learning about the chakras from both Indian and Western teachers and books for about 20 years, and only recently discovered that a lot of what I had been learning, practicing, and teaching wasn't accurate. So let's take a look, first of all, at this idea of how can something be known to be true and false, or accurate and inaccurate? When I'm defining those things, what I am really talking about is what can be, I suppose, solidified through going back to the ancient yogic texts. So if it comes from the ancient tantric yogic texts, if we can find it in the texts, then we can know solidly that it is part of the yoga tradition. So this, for me, is a kind of very solid basis to understand that something has validity. On the flip side, if an idea or a practice around the chakras cannot be found within the ancient tantric texts, if you're finding it in a book written by Anadia Judith or Joseph Campbell or Arthur Avalon or Carl Jung or even other Indian teachers who might have written on the chakras, and there's no basis in the texts, then we can start to question it. Okay, so let's take a look at what has happened in the history of the chakras, or the chakras as they're often known in the West, and why is it that there is this split in information. The ancient tradition of the chakras came about through the tantric tradition, which started about 300 ACE, so after the Common Era. 300, 400, 500 is where we start to see texts, tantric texts, that specifically talk about the chakras. Before then, we're looking at a different kind of philosophy called the Vedic philosophy. And there was never any mention of chakras in any serious way before the tantric tradition. There might have been, say, 3 or 4 mentions. I think in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, it might be, he says, focus on Nabhi chakra, but he's not really talking about it as this whole system of chakras that was developed in the tantric tradition. When it's described in that text, he's really just sort of saying, just focus either on the navel or focus on the nose or focus between the eyes. So there's no in-depth study in the Vedic tradition. It all begins in the tantric tradition. And what we find is that over the course of about 1100 years, the tantras, which is where this word tantric comes from, or tantra comes from, this corpus of texts known as the tantras to us today, described in great detail the system of the chakras together with manuals, very finely detailed manuals on practices for the chakras. And there was a whole philosophy in the 9 streams of Tantra they all talked about and drew upon the chakras. It was part of a fundamental tantric practice. So it was a really important part of the tantric tradition. And what happened around 1200, so 1200 ACE, is that the Mughals invaded India. And when they did, the tantric tradition was almost destroyed. So the Muslim invaders destroyed, at that time, a lot of the goddess temples, a lot of the texts, and the tradition basically had to go underground. And what happened was, of this huge corpus of texts, I mean, the culture, the tantric culture, the yogic culture has always been a very erudite culture, meaning that they were highly literate. Everything that had been proven and practiced over hundreds of years was written down. There were many thousands of texts, and of this huge body of work, many were lost. And they were lost to time. We think about it, I mean, 1200 to 1400 was when there was a lot of wars, and when the Mughals moved into India, that's 200 years of potentially losing libraries and books. And what was preserved? So there are still, of these corpus of texts, there are still preserved texts. They were given to the families of the tantrikas, and they were stored like in old attics, and the tantric pundits or the priests were handing them down generation to generation. Some of them were stored in libraries, some were kept as part of the ruling people of the time. So there was a sense that some was kept, but a lot of this work went underground, and a lot of the practices, for the most part, also stopped because it wasn't supported by the culture at the time. So there were certain practices that were still allowed within the yogic tradition, a lot of them Vedic, and the Vedic culture, for the most part, was maintained across the last 2,000 years. But tantric culture, a lot of it was lost in the last 800 years or so. What happened was that after Tantra comes Hatha, the Hatha lineage of yoga, and Hatha work draws upon Tantra in the same way that Tantra in many ways draws upon the Vedic tradition. Every tradition is drawing a little bit on its own predecessor and then innovating. So the Hatha tradition, which begins probably around the year 1300, 1400, is drawing upon this culture of Tantra, which would still have been part of common history and knowledge, but they innovate on it. And in many ways, there is a potential idea that they may have subverted some of the information. So then some of the information around very important ideas around the chakras, such as Kundalini, becomes subverted and changed. Then at around the year 1910, 1900, there are a couple of things that are going on in the West. So there is an author who calls himself Arthur Avalon, who discovers the Chakra Nirupana, which is the six chakra system, which is really a kind of late Hatha text, which is drawn upon a lot of tantric ideas. He discovers it, and he is like blown away by what he reads. He's a Sanskrit scholar, and he publishes it as a book. Now, because of the nature of the way many of these texts are written, they're often written in a kind of code, and there is a sense that these books need to be cross-referenced with other texts and other manuals. But Arthur Avalon, that's his pseudonym, the real name is Sir John Woodruff, or the other way around, I'm pretty sure his real name is Sir John Woodruff. He translates this text and gets a few things wrong. It's called The Serpent Power. He's describing Kundalini. And when he describes some of these things and translates them into English. I mean, he's obviously a very brilliant man. He's discovered this text, but there are a few things that are translated incorrectly into this book. And this book goes on to be a kind of huge hit in New Age circles in the West. Simultaneously, there is another group called the Theosophical Society, and one of its leaders is called Madame Blavatsky. They're working in both India and the US, and this is around the turn of the century. A lot of New Age ideas are starting to be formed, and as she creates the Philosophical Society, I think with another founding member, she comes across two texts around the chakras. One is this 6+1 chakra system that you might have heard of, and the other is I think 9 chakra system. The philosophy of the Theosophical Society is that all religions are welcome, and they often kind of cherry pick the best of the best with religions and ideas. And she didn't really like the 9 chakra system and decided to go with the 7 chakra system. And this is the same system that simultaneously Arthur Avalon is using. And what happens then is that she and this group of people at the Theosophical Society start overlaying ideas of the Kabbalah and other religious ideas onto the chakras. And then this book simultaneously comes out in the West. People are fascinated by this idea. It resonates with them because the chakras are a kind of, you could say, cross-cultural phenomenon. It doesn't matter whether you are Indian or whether you're from the West or anywhere else in the world, there is a sense that there is a fundamental understanding of what the chakras mean. There is a deep fascination for people. This idea of energy within the central column of the body makes sense to a lot of people. And these focal points of energy and meditation are very powerful. So it starts to grow in the West. But what you find is in the West, they aren't drawing upon, in the West, we don't draw upon the classical tradition. First of all, it's really hard to get the texts. A lot of them are still hidden in attics and people's homes or in libraries in the Kashmir where they've been kind of given the wrong Sanskrit names and they haven't been archived properly. So in the West, you read a book about something and you assume that, you know, it's coming from a text, it's got validity. But what happens then is that in the West, the nature of the capitalist mind is to start innovating and creating something new. So what you find then is Carl Jung, who in the 1920s was a prolific psychologist, brilliant scholar, comes across Arthur Avalon's book and he decides to innovate on it. So he reads about the chakras and he starts to overlay mental, emotional ideas onto the chakras, which is something that a lot of people would think are the traditional practices. Then Joseph Campbell comes along, he starts to do the same thing, Anadia Judith. On top of that, we have the Theosophical Society who are overlaying ideas about colors, emotions, deities. They're kind of mishmashing all of the traditions, putting them on top of the chakras and creating something completely new. And so what has happened today is that we are reading books written in English that are drawing upon other books written in English that were drawing upon maybe Carl Jung's work or the Theosophical Society that was drawing upon this original serpent power text that was fundamentally mistranslated and didn't have other reference points. And so we have quite a limited view of the chakras. And on top of that, we have an innovated view. So I prefer to use this word innovated because I don't want to be kind of running around saying that everybody is wrong. It's just that what we learn about the chakras now is not what comes from the texts. So it wasn't part of the tradition, the ancient tantric tradition, which lasted for about 1100 years. So these were highly formulated ideas that grew over 1,000 years of practice. So they have a lot of validity to them. And what this series of lectures, I'd love you to have a listen to all of these lectures, are about is kind of shattering some of the myths that you might know about the chakras and have decided or kind of have believed to be factual and true and part of the tantric tradition. And this can be coming from India or the West, because there has been in the last 200 years so much cross-cultural pollination of ideas around yoga. I have learnt from Indian teachers a whole lot of stuff around the chakras that I have recently found out didn't come from the texts themselves. So this is our brief history into the chakras, why a lot of what you might know is probably fundamentally incorrect. And what I'm hoping is not to make anyone feel bad about the fact that they might be teaching or reading the books or practicing in this innovative way, but it's more to start to spread this idea of an accurate understanding of the chakras. And this is something that I'm going to do over the course of the next 7 or so lectures. Thank you so much.